And then we have some member-driven bills. So the first two slides you saw were bills that came forward from the department based on what they knew to be needed. These are bills that members themselves brought forward. In this case, these three made it into both bills. The companion bills made it into both omnibus bills. So the first is restricting the posting of correction orders until after there's been a period for reconsideration. The second one is instead of putting every detail on the licensing lookup about a requirement, I'm sorry, pardon me, about any kind of correction order, this would say that there is a summary, and it's a more detailed summary so that parents in particular, families, others looking at that information understand the context. And conversely, you don't have any more the posting of the letters and some of the other communication that can be confusing. And then the last one is actually current practice, and it's something that was due to sunset in 2026. And again, members on both sides brought forward a bill to continue it and make it standing legislation. So this is a piece of legislation we've talked about in these updates before that gives some flexibility, I guess I would say, to centers to utilize their aides at certain times of the day or for a certain amount of the day to help cover classrooms as long as some of the, or really all of the elements that you see here are true. So those three bills on both sides made it into both the House and the Senate omnibus bill. Now we have some bills that are specific to the House, and then we have a couple that are specific to the Senate. Because there was a Children and Families Committee in the House, understandably, that was its only focus. I would say that more bills, frankly, got heard in the first place. So that led to more legislation making it into the House side of the omnibus bill. So these are just some of the pieces. The first couple are carried by Representative West, who is the co-chair of the committee. And this all kind of starts to tie in with his major issue all session, which was focused on maltreatment, focused on concerns about safety of children. And so a couple of these things you can see seem to track with that in terms of changes he would like to have seen. The third one is something that's been in existence through a competitive grant. This would basically make the diaper distribution grant program a direct allocation to the Diaper Bank of Minnesota, that is who has received the competitive grant in the past and been running it since its inception. So this just kind of takes out the middle person. And we're not sure where this next one came from. To be honest with you, it was never heard as a bill, but it's most likely a dollar savings device to make some of the other things possible. So right since the inception of the Great Start Compensation Support Program, there has always been an additional 10% available for programs that are serving high or low income families or serving CCAP families in some what were constructed as equity areas. And for whatever reason, this bill now removes that extra 10%. That is not in the Senate bill, but it is in the House bill. The last two are pieces that came out of Representative Zeleznikar's bill, and these are again in the spirit of kind of trying to nibble around the edges, maybe in terms of making at least things a little bit more fluid or supportive for programs. So in the first case, this has been talked about for a very long time, that when we have family child care folks having their own children in their program, having to count them against the ratio has been problematic. And so the compromise was one child could be counted basically outside of ratio as long as they were 8 years old or older. So it can't be an infant, it can't be a toddler, but if you've got a current school ager that happens to live in your home, who's your child, they don't need to be counted into the ratio. And then the last one, as you can see, is a very specific piece of legislation around having variances if things are within 100 feet of what is required for indoor space. So these aren't groundbreaking. Well, perhaps the one around caregivers' children being excluded feels groundbreaking, but these are ways in which, while we wait for the final modernization project to start sort of addressing some of those challenges. This is probably the biggest piece of legislation that took up both energy, emotion, time in the House this year. And again, Representative West came into this session indicating that this was going to be his top priority, so it was not a surprise. I think for the most part, the testimony was both difficult to hear, but also really respectful and balanced between families whose children had suffered harm at the hands of childcare programs and childcare programs themselves, acknowledging the deep pain that that caused and the fact that that never should happen, but also trying to bring forward some of the business concerns for what would, not only business, but privacy concerns, I would say, of having cameras in programs. So there were several iterations of this bill. This is where we landed in the House. So first, you can see that the big compromise was now, first of all, early on, the compromise was centers only, so there would not be cameras in family child care. And here the compromise is only a center who's required to post a maltreatment order. So if they've already been found to have maltreatment, that's when they will be required to have cameras. And then the rest of the information flows from there. It's primarily focused on infants and toddlers, and then public spaces where everyone could be, including infants and toddlers. Premise being that those are the youngest children who obviously can't speak up for themselves if something is going on. The cameras are now deemed to be closed circuits, so some of the concerns about hacking or availability of camera or footage is addressed. And then if programs already have cameras, they don't need to necessarily comply with all the elements in this bill. There's quite a lot in the bill that gets at length of time the footage needs to be stored, at what resolution, etc. So that is covered in the bill. But if somebody already has a camera, then that is, they're sort of already included. And then finally, there was a lot of concern about parents having access, both on one hand, parents wanting access, but also what does that do to the privacy of the other children in the room? So the compromise was parents can request footage if they do have a doctor's note or doctor's documentation saying that there's suspicion of an injury. And finally, there is some money. There's two ways this is happening. There's, as you saw in the first slide, there's some additional money being made available to help with grants. And then there also is enabling language so that the current technology grants that exist can be used for this purpose. So at least a nod to try to help programs who will need to do this, help cover those costs. It's a one-time appropriation, but hopefully that will help cover one of the other concerns. So this whole thing is not in the Senate. And I would say this is probably the most glaring difference between the House and Senate bill when it comes to policy, at least, where there's going to need to be negotiation. I don't believe this bill was even heard in the Senate. Finally, there's a bill carried by, as you can see here, Representative Coulter, which starts to make some changes again related to licensing and kind of in the spirit of lending a different lens maybe on the regulation modernization efforts. And so that was a hearing that was held that would be on some of these elements, but these are the elements that made it into the bill for now. And again, try to start to ease our way into some of the changes that the field in particular has been asking for. So I won't read to you per se, but it does try to address the elements and also the funding needs to make those happen. Now we'll move to the Senate. So again, everything you just saw will eventually have to line up with everything on these next few slides, and that will be done after the break and after the bills get a vote. We'll talk about that at the end. So first of all, as I mentioned, there is a piece in the Senate bill that directs the commissioner to conduct a scan of out-of-school and youth programming. This was heard in the House but not accepted, so at least there's some familiarity with the issue, so that will need to be negotiated. And then here is the biggest difference on the Senate side, and again, I would say that in spirit, it lines up a lot with that previous bill you just saw from Representative Coulter, in that they all strive to make this modernization effort more meaningful for the field, perhaps address things that the practitioners have not necessarily seen. And so in the case of this bill, it is focused primarily on family child care and some of the concerns of the family child care community. So as you can see, just some language that reminds everybody that it needs to be child-centered, family-friendly, and fair. It dictates some ways in which the department, as it moves forward with the work in the next year, needs to interact with the community. So both the frequency, the time of day, and then also providing things in languages other than English, so that there's truly an opportunity for family child care providers to engage in the process. And then finally stipulating that nothing that comes out of this process in the next year or so can start or be implemented before January 1st, 2027. So really creating that ramp up in that timeline to ensure that people are engaged and also informed. So that's the end of the Health and Human Services / Children and Families negotiation potential. There are two other bills that have made it through the process so far, much smaller, much more targeted. First, as you can see, and there isn't necessarily new language, but both the House and the Senate agriculture bills included some additional funding for the program that brings farm to school and early childhood or childcare. So the only difference there is there's a little bit more money in the House side, 500,000 per biennium versus the Senate, 300,000. So that one seems like a potentially easy compromise, and good to remember that there are other ways we can continue to address some of the needs in the childcare community. Finally, in the Senate Jobs and Economic Development Bill, there are two programs that came in asking for some additional funding. In the first one, you will see Women Venture, another million in 26-27. Women Venture has been at this for a while in terms of using their model, which is really helping women entrepreneurs start businesses, but applying that to helping women entrepreneurs start new childcare businesses. So this is funding for them to expand that effort. And then finally, there's been a longstanding project at Goodwill Easter Seals called the Father Project, which, just like it sounds, engages fathers in their children's lives and does support and other kinds of training. And that received on the Senate side another $2 million. As I mentioned at the top, we're waiting on the House Jobs and Economic Development Bill. That's one where, unfortunately, the target is a cut. So it has been very difficult, I think, for that committee to come to agreement. And whether these same items, which did get heard on the House side, will make it into the bill, we will see. So again, another topic, these are topics for negotiation at conference time. Speaking of conference time, here are the next steps for those of you unfamiliar. So as I mentioned, the legislature is on break right now until April 22nd. When they come back that day, the bills will start to head in the House. Anything that made it through the process goes to the Ways and Means Committee for a final stop. That's another place, by the way, where there could be additions added, so amendments can be made. In the Senate, they go to the Finance Committee, sometimes the Tax Committee, depending. And then in both cases, they go on then to the floor. So we should see in the next 2 weeks or so, most of the bills that I just reviewed for you making it through those stops and on for floor votes. Once they've been voted on the floor, then we see them go to a conference committee, which is made up of equal numbers of people from the House side and the Senate side, most often the chairs of those committees and other members who are familiar. And they will negotiate, sort of hash out those differences I mentioned. As I pointed out here, a couple more bills still need work. We don't have a lot in the House, if anything, in the House and Senate education bill, but just to say that there is still work to be done on those two bills. So we will have more details after the break. And then it's always true that the tax and the bonding bills get done primarily later. And so there's a few things floating around that I've reported on here that are potential tax breaks, particularly for family childcare and sometimes for centers. And then we anticipate some small bonding projects that are related to something to do with childcare based on the bills that have been introduced. So the key two bullets here are those last two. All of that stuff you see above has to happen by the constitutionally designated deadline of May 19th. And we have to have a budget in Minnesota. Unlike some states or the federal government, we do not have the option of, as they say, kicking the can down the road. If there's not a budget in place in time for July 1st, then all bets are off and potentially there is a shutdown. So when the session ends on the 19th, if things aren't done, there's the option of calling a special session. Sometimes what happens is legislators in the governor's office step away, do some behind the scenes negotiations, bring the legislature back in for 1 or 2 days and finalize things. Hard to know at this moment what will happen, but wouldn't be surprising if that process does have to take place, given all the challenges you've seen. So we will not do an update next week because they will just be coming back into session unless we discover things that we did not report on. So be looking for us to come back here the following week. So that would be Tuesday, April 29th. And by then we should have some movement to report. In the meantime, visit our bill tracker, look for that written update that covers everything I just did. Feel free to look at some of these bills yourself to see the details and let me know if there's anything we can cover. Otherwise, we'll see you back here on April 29th. Thanks, everybody.